All right, so let's get into it. So this past Tuesday, we had an election. And this morning, I just want to close out this series where we've been kind of digging into what does it mean specifically, I'm talking to the church, to Christians. And I recognize that not everybody that's in the room is a professing Christian or has said, I'm going to live my life in allegiance to Jesus. But there's a lot of us who have, and our primary concern is understanding and discerning what does it mean for us to kind of navigate and to walk where we have our feet set in sort of two worlds. One, the world in which we live. And for us, in our particular context, that happens to be the United States of America. Now, there are Christians who have a different story. There are Christians that are citizens of other nations. Some of those nations have forms of government that are very similar to ours, and some of them live in and under governments that are radically different from ours. But who we are as brothers and sisters throughout the world remains the same. And so this conversation of what does it mean for us to live within the particular worldly context in which we live, but then also understand that we are also citizens of what we might describe as another kingdom, another empire, another regime. And that is the kingdom that was inaugurated and is under the rule of Jesus. How do we, especially when we find that those two kingdom forces or empirical forces are in conflict with one another, how do we as Christians work with that? How do we deal with that? And so for 4 weeks now, and here in our final week together, we've been trying to understand a little better what are the implications for us as Christians. And I hope it's been beneficial. I hope that regardless of where you may describe yourself as living on the political spectrum, you found what we've been wrestling with to be challenging. That has been sort of my aim. And I'll be honest, coming into this final week, just sort of thinking about how do we wrap this up, it's very challenging. The reality is I think that I could spend a lot more time. I could spend many, many more weeks. I think that even as we get ready to finish, as far as the series goes, we're not anywhere near finished when it comes to understanding who we are called to be, politically speaking, in our world. That this is just an introduction, and now we have to see ourselves being launched out into how we are going to be and how we are going to live in the world. So anyway, Tuesday we had the election, and I don't know how you handled Tuesday, whether you went to vote or didn't vote, right? We've got, I'm sure, people from both of those camps. But then after you voted, and then at 7 o'clock when many of the polls in our country were closed, and then just kind of in the ensuing hours as polls continued to close, what did you do about that? Did you just go to bed at your normal time? Did you turn on the television and watch as things were developing? I'll tell you, I stayed up until 3 o'clock in the morning, which is weird for me, and something I'm not very good at anymore. I used to be able to do that pretty easily, and I found on Wednesday I was kind of a mess. But I for a guy, if you know me, I have a tendency of being pretty out of the loop with things. And if you really know me, you know that's a really gross understatement. The joke is that if there's anything with regard to pop culture, Josh knows nothing about it, and I do kind of try to operate in living in what is in front of me, and not get too ruffled by the things that are just kind of outside of my control, or that I have no real ability to influence. But anyway, I think we probably had all kinds of different ways that we responded and reacted to what was going on Tuesday. And I wonder, have you ever thought about how Jesus might have handled something like this? How Jesus' earliest followers, how the early church how they might have weighed the goings-on and the significance of something like a national election? Like, how would they have felt about, and how would they have possibly responded? You might think that they spent all their time fighting the injustices that were perpetrated by the empire under which they lived. And believe me, the empire under which Jesus lived, his earliest followers in the early church, was a grossly unjust empire. Now, you can launch all kinds of criticisms to the nations of modernity, specifically the West, of which, such countries as the United States is a part. And there are definitely plenty of ways in which the West and the United States continues to perpetrate injustices, but you can also tell at the same time that we, as a people, regardless of where we may be on the political spectrum, there's a desire in most of us to be moving toward what is right, or at least moving toward what we think is right. And the Roman Empire didn't even necessarily provide this benefit when it came to its society. I mean, it ruled by sheer force and dominance, and it was grossly unjust, and unapologetically unjust at that. And so you might think, again, that Jesus' main message would have been opposition to the empire. You'd think that perhaps the church might have spent much of its energy committed to vanquishing empire. But what you actually find is that they spent their energy instead of directing attention to the empire, they were directing attention to something else entirely, which was the kingdom of Jesus that had come into the world. That became the main focus of their optics. This is the thing that they directed people's attention to. And I think that for a large part, the reason is they had little to do with how they could actually impact the forces of empire, but what they could do is they could live their lives in obedience to Jesus. That was the decision that they had, that they could make every single day of their lives, regardless of who happened to be in power, regardless of what the regime looked like, regardless of how they may or may not have been treated, even with regard to their own particular beliefs. They had the opportunity as individuals, they had opportunities as groups of individuals, this thing that we call the church, the ecclesia of Christ. They had the opportunity every single morning to get up and commit themselves to either walking in the way of Jesus or not. Now, last week we talked about what it means for the Christian and what it means for the church as a political entity to be subversive. Remember, we introduced this concept of subversiveness. That is, Paul, in one particular place in the book of Acts, was accused, he and people like him, of turning the world upside down. And what that was describing the subversive nature of the church. To be subversive means to upend something, to disturb or to unsettle the status quo. As one translation, the translation that we looked at last week, it meant to turn the world upside down. But how did they subvert it? Like, how did they actually go? Like, if they were going to ultimately upend the power of empire, how did they do it? You and I, our minds immediately go to ideas of things like violent revolution, of carrying the sword into battle in order to upend the powers that be. But how did Jesus' followers do this? How did the church come and turn the world upside down? You could make the case, I think, that one of the most powerful ways that the early church worked to topple empire was by their attitude of indifference toward empire. Let me just kind of introduce you the concept of the shrug. Y'all know what the shrug is? Like, you do the shrug from time to time, do you not? What is the shrug? The shrug is, right? It's a reaction of indifference. You know, something happens, and the more dramatic people in the room, you know, and then there's others that are just like, This describes the differences in some of the ways you all parent your kids, right? The early church seemed to, like, when it came to empire and their understanding of how they were to be, whatever happened to be going on, as the powers ebbed and flowed and moved, there seemed to be a measure of indifference. Because again, what they were most committed to was daily waking up and surrendering their lives in obedience to Jesus. That's what mattered. I wonder if, because we live in a system where we have, and we talked about this last week, the ways in which we can involve ourselves in the affairs of government are, for most of us, very different from what it would have been like for the early church. Like, we get to do things like we get to vote, we get to run for office, we get to participate in the political process. But I just wonder, what if, let's say on Tuesday, what if we all voted? What if we all went to bed? What if we all woke up in the morning, we got the results, and then just went, I'd like us to be thinking about a couple of things this morning. And I'm especially speaking to a segment of us that, how can I describe it? Would have viewed the results of the election with a certain kind of excitement. And I'm not telling you that you should feel wrong or you should feel bad about that. I just want you to know from the outset that this is especially, I think, who I want to speak to this morning. It really should be all of us, and hopefully, regardless of where you find yourself or whatever may be your political alignments, you'll be challenged. But it's no secret. Like, when you think about Christianity in the United States of America, Christianity it's far more tied to the Republican Party than it is to the Democratic Party. Like, that's just the reality. And I think it's inarguable that there has been, in our experience and in our lifetimes, an alliance that has forged between something like a political party and the Church of Christ. And we've been all throughout this series talking about how dangerous such an alliance is, and I think this morning we want to speak one final time to that. So anyway, what I want us to be thinking about, because this is a common kind of thread within the thinking of the American Christian especially, and especially those of us who have a more conservative approach to our political lives. I told you in week number 1, that's how I would describe myself. And so, if I may, to whatever extent you find me making any kind of criticism toward a certain kind of person, this is largely pointing at me, myself. So the questions are, should the United States retain its glory and its preeminence in the world until Jesus returns? as if like we could look at the United States as being this entity that God has blessed the world with, that sort of stands in between. It's this transitional stage between the wicked empire that we have known and the kingdom of Jesus that is eventually going to come in its fullness. The United States represents, in its best form, a sort of transitional state. Secondly, should the United States be looked at like the special people chosen by God, similar to if you're a student of the Bible, you know that God especially chose the nation of Israel and made a covenant with them prior to Christ coming into the world, but for the purpose of bringing Christ into the world. And not so that a nation defined by a kind of ethnicity or even by its geographical borders, could continue for time immemorial to be blessed by God as the nation of Israel considered of itself, but rather so that the fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham could take place, the promise that he made that all of the world, that all of the nations of the world would be blessed. If we answer yes to either of these questions, I just want to caution we may be in danger of worshiping the very thing that the Bible comes against. And specifically this morning, the book of Revelation, which is where I'd like for us to turn. If you have your Bibles, let's turn to Revelation chapter 5. I told you last week that I believe that the church and that Christianity still continues to offer the greatest hope to this world for a number of reasons. And one of those reasons was the narrative arc of human history that Christianity invites us to participate in. That is, you will find in, I think, pretty much every other worldview and religion, a tendency to not really be able to see the beginning from the end. But Christianity does. Christianity helps us it gives us context for understanding where we came from, helps us to kind of know where we are, and just as importantly, helps us to know where we're ultimately headed. In theological conversations, we use a fancy word, which is the eschaton. How many of you have heard of the eschaton? Or perhaps have heard of eschatology. The eschaton simply means the last thing. Eschatology is the study of the last things. In Christianity, the last thing is really the climax and the conclusion of this present age. But with it comes this complete restoration and to God's creation. So in a way, it is also a beginning of the final state of eternity. One thing that we have to understand, I think better, as Christians certainly, is that we are not headed for this like meaningless existence of disembodied spirits that are floating around in a state of unconsciousness, of purposeless euphoria. We use the language of things like going to heaven, but while that's fine, I think it's probably more accurate for us to think of being physically restored into a renewed creation. Yes, it's heaven, but really it's a new earth. That's the way the Bible describes the state of eternity that we are ultimately headed to. And this new earth is vastly different from the present earth, right? It is described as having no more death and no more sorrow, no more pain or famine or disease, no more poverty or oppression, no more unfairness, no more where the strong take advantage of the weak. And so Revelation, the final book in our Bibles, has a lot to say about the last things. And so in Revelation chapter 5, I want to read verses 1 through 6. And can we stand in honor to God's word this morning? Verse 1, then I saw in the right hand of the one seated on the throne a scroll with writing on both sides, sealed with 7 seals. I also saw a mighty angel proclaiming with a loud voice, "Who is worthy to open the scroll and break its seals?" But no one in heaven or on earth or under the earth was able to open the scroll or even to look in it. I wept and wept because no one was found worthy to open the scroll or even to look in it. I think that what we find being described here is this scene where a scroll sealed with these 7 seals, a scroll which is intended to be opened and read, is not able to be opened and read because there's nobody that possesses the authority to do so. And so here the author, John, he is weeping at the fact that no one has been found worthy to open the scroll. Then, verse 5, one of the elders said to me, "Do not weep. Look, the Lion from the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has conquered so that he is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals." And then I saw one like a slaughtered lamb standing in the midst of the throne. Thank you. You may be seated. So if you have your Bibles or if you are using an electronic form of the Bible that you can mark up, I'd encourage you to circle or to underline or to highlight there in verse 5, the lion that is being described, as well as in verse 6, the slaughtered lamb. Let me ask you, what is it that you think of when you think of authority? What do you think of when you think of authority in the animal kingdom? What do you think of? The lion, right? Isn't the lion the king of the jungle? Right? The lion, as described here in Revelation, it connects us to the Messiah, the promised king who comes from the line of the great King David, right? Who comes from the line of Judah. Judah, if they had a sigil and a banner, would undoubtedly have borne the image of the lion. And so the lion was, in the mind of the Jew, the image of the Messiah. But when we read this passage, what do we find? John here is told to stop weeping and to look because the Lion of the tribe of Judah is worthy to open the scroll. And you can imagine that John, just as he's wiping the tears from his eyes and trying to get his wits about him again, and begins to turn to look, he's imagining that lion. But what does he actually, in fact, see? He sees not a lion, but rather a lamb, a slaughtered lamb. Why do you suppose the author here, while provoking in us the idea of something like a ferocious lion, the king of the jungle, the great beast, the animal you wouldn't mess with, why do you suppose all of a sudden, rather than actually seeing a lion, we are instead introduced to the lamb? I mean, when it comes to like who it is that we want to lead us, if given the opportunity, is it not going to be the lion that we're going to choose? One author made the statement, it's easy to follow a fierce lion, but who wants to follow a lamb? Like, which line do you suppose you would choose if given the opportunity to follow into a world rife with danger and difficulty? Do you want the lion going before you, or are you going to follow something like the lamb? Well, John then tells us why the lamb is in fact worthy, and why you find here in this chapter everybody around just starts falling down to worship the lamb. You'd think it was because of his convincing dominance, that he was something like the tallest, the biggest, the strongest, the most forceful presence in the room, I've recently started watching this series called John Adams. And you probably remember from studying history that whenever there are descriptions of General George Washington, he is described as being head and shoulders the tallest and the biggest in the room, right? Like, and this series sort of depicts him as such. Like, there's no one else that's even like him. This is sort of what you would come to expect. Or you think it was because of his battle-tested fierceness, right? Like, you don't want to mess with this guy, right? Who is it that's going to lead us? It's this one, big, strong, and mighty. You think that as everyone is falling down in front of it, they would be doing it out of just a overwhelming kind of fear and awestruckness toward the lion. But in verse 9, this is what it says. It says, and they sang a new song. Here's the song. They said, you are worthy to take the scroll and open its seals because you were slaughtered. And you purchased people for God by your blood from every tribe and language and people and nation. You made them a kingdom and priests to our God, and they will reign on the earth. I don't know if any of you caught on, but we sing a song from time to time that uses these very lyrics. What you and I have to beware of as Christians is the danger of ruining what Revelation was meant to grow in us. Revelation, and there are a lot of different ways that people approach the difficulty of interpreting and understanding the book of Revelation. And so for a lot of people, they just avoid it. But Revelation really is, in essence, an extremely political book of the Bible. And it is intended to grow something in those of us who have pledged our allegiance to, as what is described here in chapter 5, the Lamb, the slaughtered Lamb. So we have to be very, very careful not to ruin what Revelation is trying to grow in us. And also, we have to beware of the danger of trying to rebuild the very things that Revelation was written with the intent to destroy. Too often when we think of Revelation, we think of the judgment that God is going to pour out on them, right? The people that are not us. The seals that are broken, the pestilences that are let loose, right? Like all of this apocalyptic kind of activity that is occurring. It is done with the intention of pouring out the wrath and the judgment of God on them. We think of the culmination of all that is wicked, ushered into the great battle of Armageddon, where God will finally wipe out all of his enemies. The problem is when we do this and when we reduce the book of Revelation to merely these kinds of themes, what we end up doing is losing the profound description of the most central figure in the book, which is the Lamb of God. I did a quick search, just, on like Bible Gateway. The Lamb is found nearly 30 times in the book of Revelation. The lion, in reference to Jesus, the best I can tell, is used only once, and that is here in chapter 5, where he is immediately transformed from a lion into a lamb. So when John gets eventually around to seeing what is described as the Lion of Judah, he sees not a lion, but the lamb. When we dismiss the nature of the Lamb, then we end up undoing what Revelation is all about. As Christians, we even end up using Revelation sometimes to defend the very thing that it is protesting all along. And what is it protesting? It's protesting the confidence that we are sometimes tempted to place in. And it is protesting the worship that we sometimes devote ourselves to in the city of man, as opposed to embracing and working toward and living out the city of God. What you find in the narrative of Revelation is that God intends to bring us into the city of God, which necessarily means he must destroy the city of man, or what we'll often refer to as the kingdoms of this world, or empire for short. The book of Revelation, what it's doing is it's playing off something that Jesus taught us. Right? Jesus taught us that whoever will save his life will lose it, and whoever will lose his life for my sake will find it. What Jesus was doing was he was pointing at the flaw in worshiping and preserving what is temporary and on its way out. And let me tell you, there is nothing that is more temporary, and there is nothing more on its way out than the governments of this world. Like, we've just seen it. We just saw what I suppose many would describe as a pretty large shift, right? In the world's terms, the balance of power has changed in a day. And likely, in a couple of years, it could happen again. In 4 years, it could happen drastically again. I mean, we don't know. There is seemingly nothing so temporary as the empire and the kingdoms of this world. And it is wrong for any of us to fall down and prostrate ourselves and give ourselves to the worship of empire, regardless of how you may feel about it. The city of man, as we might describe it, it calls on us to pledge our allegiance to it instead of Christ. It does this in one of at least a couple of different ways. The first one is that empire rejects God as the brand for the empire. That is, it would say of itself, we are going to be a country without God. We have seen the narrative of our country oftentimes, again, depending on what, who, or how those who are in power. We find in other modern nations such a not even a separation, but even a repulsion of things that are maybe considered religious, right? That the moral mandate is we're going to be a country without God. And such a country must rule itself in other ways. For some, it will be given to science, or science and pseudoscience, right? It's science that's going to rule us. Or perhaps it latches itself onto the pursuit of hedonism, right? This want for pleasure, this, what we're going to do is pursue the things that make us as a society the most happy. And those are the things that determine what the rule will be like. Then there's the technocracy, and we see this in growing terms. As our technological advances continue to go at the pace and rate at which they're going, there is a higher degree of trust that is put into the experts and the specialists, right? The elites who we will allow to rule us. And then there is the rule by utility. That is, well, what is going to be the most beneficial for the most people? And the moral clause happens to be something like, well, if it's useful, then it's good, right? If this can perform some use for some person, then it's good. And so these are different ways that a country can commit itself to its own rule without God. But the second way, the empire looks to find allegiance from its citizenry is not by rejecting God as the brand for its empire, but using God as the brand for the empire. Here, the confession is, we will be God's country. Instead of we will be a country that's free from God, it says we're going to be God's country. And the problem with this is, again, it's another form of empire. It may be like if you happen to be a person that loves God and wants to live for God, it may be a little more difficult for you to discern the ways in which the dragon of Revelation is animating the powers of empire. But if you look closely enough, you will find it. Let me give you a few suggestions. We validate ourselves by our prosperity. The prosperity, let's say, of the United States of America gives us an opportunity to look at ourselves as being blessed by God. The problem is that on the other end, it imposes no limits on things like, well, how wealthy can we become? There's no limit. Or how wide can the gap be between the rich and the poor? Because we're not evaluating things on those metrics. What we're looking at is the prosperity that we are enjoying and attributing it to the fact that, well, God's blessed us. We validate ourselves through the practice of patriotism. I think it's perfectly appropriate for the citizens of a nation to be proud of the country that they were born into, to the degree that it is seeking to be just and right. It is perfectly proper for a person to be proud of the culture that they were born into. But our patriotism, I'm afraid, can validate things that will find themselves in conflict with the kingdom of Christ. We can validate things like the military dominance that we exercise. And then it imposes, it frees us of any limits whatsoever on where we can be or what force we can use to protect and to further our national interests. Like even to the extreme of doing something like maintaining an arsenal of nuclear weapons. We justify the end of, well, what we're about is we're about spreading peace. We're about spreading democracy, right? That's the end. But we then justify that end by the means of things like the threat of violence and war. We can't get into, and it is far more complicated than how we can possibly hash out on a Sunday morning, but I've got to instigate something in those of you who are following Jesus to see there's something wrong with that. We validate ourselves by our love of liberty. Listen, liberty's great. Listen, I would much rather be free than not free. Anybody else? Freedom's great. Liberty is wonderful. But our liberty, sometimes it validates what we feel is our God-given role in the world as a shining city on a hill, as has been famously said. And then what it does, the outcome of that is it takes something like the personal freedoms that you and I enjoy, and it puts them up above what might otherwise be beneficial constraints for the larger community. Like, I'm far more concerned about my own personal liberty than I am about what is best for the community. And then finally, we validate ourselves through our exceptionalism, right? Exceptionalism, or this feeling of self-importance. It validates things like our pursuit of global economic superiority. Like it says, listen, we've got to be the supreme economic force in the world. What would happen to the global economy if the dollar suffered, right? Those are the kinds of things you're going to hear. And I'm not an economist, and I suspect that if something really bad went down with the dollar, that it's probably going to screw up the economies of the world. Granted. But what we do, like in our own self-importance, is we then ignore the actions and the policies that we're involved in that harm other countries, that harm other people groups, that harm the environment, right? And so the point is both of those systems worship empire. One does it in its rejection of God. The other one does it in the name of God. And the reality is that outside the church, like forget about in here, outside the church, the danger is likely in the first one, right? Of trying to govern apart from an understanding that God created this world and God rules over all, and that there are things like moral absolutes, there are things that are right, and there are things that are wrong. Right? This idea that we can somehow navigate our way through this world and live in a way that is properly just and political with one another, apart from the reality that God exists and God reigns and God rules. Like that is super, super problematic. And that is a problem for those outside the church, to think that we can actually live in a way that is headed in the right direction apart from God. That is outrageous. But listen, inside the church, our danger is far more likely to fall in our allegiance to this unholy conflation of God and country. Revelation calls the church, right? We studied the church, the ecclesia of Christ. Revelation calls the church to endure. It calls us to conquer. But the way that we are called to conquer, it surprises us. When you read Revelation, you're going to find the way that you as a follower of Jesus are called to conquer in this world. It's going to surprise you. In the same way that when we were looking for a lion to lead us, instead we find a slaughtered lamb. Listen, in Revelation chapter 12, verses 10, 11, then I heard a loud voice in heaven say, the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have now come, because the accuser of our brothers and sisters, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been thrown down, right? This is the picture of the dragon being thrown down, of Satan being vanquished and conquered. But listen to how that conquering is accomplished in verse 11. They conquered him by what? By the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they did not love their lives to the point of death. What we find in the book of Revelation is that the dragon, or Satan, breathes life into empire, whatever form it may happen to take. It is the means by which he uses to win our allegiance. And isn't that what he wants? Right? Like, you ever heard the expression, sell your soul to the devil? What is it that the devil wants? But your and my allegiance. And how does he go about to get it? By presenting us with an option to worship him through the vehicle of empire. Listen, we never really got to talk a lot about the way in which we as Christians are called to submit, but it's a very, very important feature of our political lives. We are called to submit to government because its authority is derived from God. But while we are submitting to that government, we are also to be suspicious of it and ready to subvert it, because it is always, in the end, going to demand too much from us. When it comes to our allegiance, it is not going to be content with a mere shrug or a mere given to submission. It wants our allegiance. Political leaders are always going to demand too much. Political parties are always going to demand too much. They want you to be everything that they are for. They want you to be everything against everything that they are against. But we, as the church, we have to be for another kingdom. And so how we conquer is we conquer by refusing to worship the dragon. We conquer by refusing to give our allegiance to empire. We conquer by not giving governors, senators, presidents, and kings more than they deserve, even when they demand it, even when it costs us our lives. This is what it means to shrug them off. Kind of like, I don't remember which week it was, but we talked about Jesus when he was presented with the coin. He said, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not? And he looks at the thing, he says, whose picture is this? And they said, it's Caesar's. It's almost like he just went, if Caesar wants it back, give it back to him. Just shrugs it off. The way of Jesus is the way of subversion and submission. And so what you and I are called to, I just kind of close with a few thoughts about how we as the church are going to subvert and submit in terms of the power that we feel we have. Like, we're all here this morning, and some of you following Tuesday, you feel empowered. Some of you following Tuesday, you feel disempowered, right? And so let me speak to all of us this morning, regardless of where you may kind of find yourself feeling in regards to the power and control you may or may not have. Patrick Schreiner, when it comes to the tactics of submission and subversion, gives us some really handy advice with how to understand this in the context of our power. So let me just close with these 4 statements. Number 1, if you find yourself possessing little power, then we practice submission through self-yielding. Right? This should be no surprise to us, right? You don't possess the power. What does it mean for you to submit to the authority in your life? Well, it means to yield. And that just might be the reality of how many of us have to kind of like deal with where we're at. We can always fight, right? But when it comes to the practice of submission, the practice of understanding the authorities even of this world, the authorities that are even animated by the power of the dragon, those authorities are still derived from God, and they are ultimately answerable to God. And that you and I as Christians, we have a responsibility to the extent that we're able to submit to those authorities. That's what we're called to do. And so sometimes my submission is going to look like self-yielding. But what about if I feel like I possess great power? Well, with greater power, we practice submission through sacrifice. And we'd have to ask ourselves the question, well, what might Jesus be asking me to give up, right? If I find myself as the one that's in authority, if I find myself the one who possesses the power, what is it that Jesus maybe is asking me to give up? For instance, how do I submit myself to one who ranks below me? Like, think about the spheres in which maybe you possess some authority, that you have, at least in terms of the way we describe it, you're kind of in a position of power over people that are under you. What would it look like for you to submit yourself to someone who ranks below you? What would it mean for me to submit myself to someone who possesses less than I do? With greater power, we practice submission through sacrifice. Now let's talk about subversion. When it comes to subversion, if we have little power, we practice subversion through critique, right? Like, for the person that possesses little power, the way that they can engage politically is by speaking to the powers. This is where I think the prayer that we have hung up in the front of our church for the last 5 weeks now comes especially to the front. Your kingdom come, your will be done, is the prayer that Jesus told us to pray. God, as it is in your kingdom, so let that be here in your world. And so if we have little access to power, We can practice subversion by praying. And we can find our passion being fueled in recognizing how very unlike the kingdoms of this world are compared and contrasted to the kingdom of God. You may be one of those. You may be looking all around you, and all you can see is the disparity between how we are and how we ought to be. And you find yourself relatively powerless to do anything about it. You're invited to speak to it. You're invited to pray about it. This is where things like minority voices become so important. You know, it's easy for the majority to drown out and stomp all over the rights of those who are outside the majority and to treat them with injustice. And this is why, ideally speaking, this is why our nation isn't just simply a democracy. It's also a republic, right? How many of you know it? Just because a majority votes for something doesn't mean that something is good. Majority rules, yeah, but majority does not make something good or make something right. A majority can vote for something wicked. So the Republican nature of our government is constantly seeking not just what the majority wants, but also seeking the ideal of the public good, regardless of the numbers, regardless of what is just simply good for most people. And so we subvert through critique. We subvert by opening our eyes. We subvert by listening to the voices of those maybe that carry with them a different experience from our own. And then finally, if we find ourselves armed with greater power than the way that you and I as Christians, the way we practice subversion within the context of empire under which we live is through reform. That is, we leverage the power that we have to change things, to make what is wrong right, to bring justice into unjust places. So, let us as Christians, let us as the church, let us not yield ourselves to the beast of empire, to the empires of this world. We're called, as the followers of Jesus, to take what he has inaugurated, his kingdom, ruled by the Lamb slaughtered for the entire world. He invites us to live out that kingdom in the world that we find ourselves in today. So you and I, we've got to do the hard work of praying, of discerning, of discussing, and of working together to achieve those ends. There's but one who deserves our undying allegiance, and that is Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the Messiah, the Savior of all the world.